Mayor Hoffman
Present.
is here, Ray Liddy,
Yep.
Bill
Here.
Werner,
Here.
and John McCoy,
Present.
and staff, Danny Castro and Lily Whalen are here. Are there any public comments on items not on the agenda?
Not today, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go on. So item number 3 is discussion of general plan update work program. I'd like to start by, I think it's helpful to give a summary of what occurred at our first meeting, which was November 9th. It's been some time, so I thought it would be helpful, but it leads into a draft work program and approach that I prepared, which is the, you all have a 2-page sheet here that outlines that, and hopefully we can look through that once after I go through this summary of the November 9th meeting. On November 9th, it was our first meeting of our general plan task force, and what I started with was what the city council charged to the task force, and that was beginning with the circulation element, review the current general plan and assess what changes are to be considered, review new legislation, and identify existing and future topics for discussion in order to set the framework and work program for the general plan update moving forward. Now, what occurred at the meeting was we had, it may not be in particular order, but we had requests from members of the public to review various documents that they brought to that meeting that occurred in the past. There was also discussion that there are other plans, whether they be master plans or action plans, that need to be looked at when we decide we're going to do a general plan update. So that was brought up. There was discussion about starting with reviewing the entire 1995 general plan as a start. And there was, the notion that, well, if we're going to do a general plan update, shouldn't we review the 1995 one to know where we need to go from there? So this is a bit random, but I want to give you a flavor of what occurred at the last meeting. If we were to start with the circulation element, we need to work on the land use element in tandem. That was also discussed, but not expanded on necessarily, just was discussed that we thought it was important. Then the Sausalito general plan needs to be consistent with the Marin County general plan with regard to regional issues. That was also talked about briefly. Also talked about briefly was a vision and guiding principles. These are overarching principles of the general plan update, and that this should come first, that we should talk about, step back and what are our big vision and guiding principles that we should do to steer this general plan update. Then, what I'm trying to tell you is this meeting went in various, and it was a first meeting, and I understand, but the next discussion was about community outreach, and we started talking about what tools to use, whether it be newsletters, direct mailings, electronic communication, separate website, Facebook, Nextdoor, how frequently do we want to reach out to the community, whether we want to have some type of media outreach committee. And then it led to, we need to have a kickoff meeting that really starts the meeting and gets the community involved to know we're going to actually launch a general plan update. That was the breadth of the meeting. You can comment on if I've missed anything, but that's really the breadth of it. I just wanted to give some background to that. So since then, I started doing some thinking about that and have questions for this committee as well, this task force. Because when I looked at the charge of what council had, it really wasn't going in that direction, but really was kind of stepping back saying, how do we want to approach this, is what I took from that meeting. So what I've done is I've created this draft general plan update work program as an approach for this task force. And I wrote an objective, I think, for this task force. Now, you can tell me that you don't, as we go through this, tell me what you agree with, and maybe what you may not agree with. And that's what's fine. I think I could use this direction from you, but this is what I recommend, is to initiate the development of a work program and approach, to work on the general plan update, and make a recommendation to the City Council to proceed with that work program and approach in March of 2016. So I don't see this, the way I see this is that the task force will give me, will initiate the work program, but then go to the City Council and provide that recommendation to the City Council soon. If it takes this meeting and another meeting, or 2 more meetings, or 3 meetings, but sometime in the spring of this year, we would go to the City Council to get the full direction. Some of the discussion topics, I think, for this task force is to confirm that the circulation element is the first element for review and update. That's what the charge was, and I just want to make sure that this is how we want to do that, to be followed in tandem with the land use element. That's not initially how the City Council charged it. The first is to look at the circulation element, determine what needs to be changed, and then come back to us.
So Danny, before you go on
Sure.
through this, I mean, maybe that's something that we should stop and ponder on. This whole, the basic approach.
Mm-hmm.
And to decide whether we really do need to do the land use in tandem. Let me throw out there a proposition, and we can shoot it all down, or we can shoot it all down. Seems to me that even if I include the Marin Strip, probably we are not going to change much of the land use anywhere in Sausalito in the foreseeable future. Therefore, wouldn't it be prudent to say, rather than go round and round and round and round in circles, let's assume the land use is fixed, and then ask what needs to be updated to the circulation element in view of the overall changing circumstances, environment changes in Sausalito that have happened since 1995, or whenever the general plan was done. Because even the Marin Ship specific task force said, if I'm not mistaken, let's focus on the infrastructure and circulation first, let's not focus on land use even there. And that's probably the only part of the city where we might even discuss land use. So why do we need to do land use in tandem when more likely than not, in the grand scheme of things, nothing will be changing in land use? Therefore, why not put it as a fix and focus on the circulation element, then loop back to the other elements afterwards to ask the question, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in fact land use is going to undergo a dramatic change in this city.
I don't know that it'd be a dramatic change, but there could be some areas that could be looked at. Specifically the Marin Ship, I don't know where the task force is on that, but I agree to start with, but I think focusing on the circulation is the best place to start and get it done. I think as we move through the different areas of the city and we're looking at each piece of that, we just pause at each one and say, is there any possibility that this will change, like say in the foreseeable future, 5 to 10 years? And if there is, then we can maybe pull that out and try and deal with it in tandem at the same time if we think it's worth dealing with, or if we're just on a fool's errand, But I think, by and large, I agree that the circulation plan is the one to start with and keep it moving, because I also agree that there's going to be very little, if any, change.
And that is, what I came out with thinking about approaching this. Let me just tell you that after I've been thinking more and more about how when the council approached this, and even from a budgetary, they looked at a possible element by element review. And I thought about that it's been done. It's a little more protracted way of doing a general plan update, but it ensures that you're kind of following one and you're in sequence. You would do that in any way when you're doing a comprehensive general plan. It's just a little bit of overlapping reviews of things. And then I thought about how much is Sausalito going to change in terms of land use, and I thought, I don't think it will. I don't think very little will change. If anything, maybe perhaps opportunities in the marine ship that might be discussed. So then when I thought about that, I said, well, let's not make this is my thought, why protract this? Let's just do a comprehensive general plan update. Circulation and land use are going to be the most important of, all general plan updates. That's the most, everything else just follows in, whether, the other topics are not as critical or as contentious or as, I think that they're not as difficult to do when you do an update. Anyway, I think I was.
What's the value in the different approach that you're proposing? I mean, it would be to make sure that we're, as a policy matter, we're on the same sort of idea about where we want to end up with all the reviews, right? So we have an overall policy statement of X. I mean, I don't know what it would be right now.
I mean, I think there's some good points that you're making, John, in that it's hard to just focus only on circulation when circulation has to do with where land uses are and how things function and the mobility between those land uses. You're going to ask that question while you're doing that. So in my mind, either you do it in tandem or you make sure you follow with it, because I think part of an exercise when you do a general plan update is you are going to look at sites that either, we've already said that the marine ship needs some help, somehow, right? So you're going to identify what they call either opportunity sites or sites where there is potential for change. And you plan for that. If there's very little change, but then you plan for that too. But you do need to begin that with some identification of that. You're looking at, for example, you're looking at circulation and you're taking inventory of the current transportation modes. That right now, how is Bridgeway running? How is these certain intersections running? How do we think it'll run in 10 years if we continue the same way we are? But in 10 years, perhaps, how do we in fact improve that? How do we factor in other modes of transportation that perhaps weren't thought about as much? Those things. I think land use in a way does.
I think you bias the circulation element by addressing it purely from the point of view of transportation. The circulation element includes sewers, water, power, everything, all of those circulatory systems that make the town work. So that without paying attention to those pretty much equally as you're going along, you're going to lose a major part of what needs to be addressed in terms of the circulation element of the general plan. It's not just cars, buses, bicycles, and parking. It's all of the other systems as well. And those are the things that I think we need to pay a lot of attention to.
Are decisions that you make, because this is the first time I've been down this road, are decisions that you make with regard to circulation plan, you go back to the general overall policy for your general plan? Like when you're talking about, do we want to talk about circulation in this area? There's one issue about functionality, but there's another issue about, as a policy matter, what type of activity.
Of course, and a lot of that has to do with not losing sight of the other elements of the general plan. In other words, we could focus on circulation because that's something that we can, we all deal with up to a point. We don't all deal with how the sewer works, but we deal with the way the streets work and so on. But whatever decisions are made or proposals are made about the future of circulation systems need to be tested as to how they impact land use, how they impact housing, how they impact all the rest of the elements. So that all of those elements, I think, have to, though we may not be thinking about them in detail, they all have to somehow be there and express whatever influence our view of the circulation, may have on them. Otherwise, we're going to have one of these one-headed animals that doesn't connect to everything else.
Is there a value then to scoping back out and looking at the general plan as a whole, which is I think what Danny's recommending, before we drill down into at least the.
Well, I think we need to do that as part of a general plan update anyway. We do need to look at what we've done already in our general plan and be able to carry over the things that are still very pertinent, and then distill what we think maybe is out of date and going in a different direction in 1995 than we are now. And that I don't think this task force. I don't think it's this task force job. I think it's a general plan advisory committee, staff, and a consultant to distill that information. I think that is just too cumbersome to do. But all of that will be done as part of this process. Like if we're going to do circulation, we're going to pull out that circulation element, and we're going to start looking at that and look at where there are opportunities to put in more policies or opportunities to hone in on those and modify them accordingly. That's where all the work is.
The other side of this is I went back and looked at that 1995 general plan and read through a whole bunch of the stuff that was in the beginning of it and so on and so forth. And a lot of it probably all still applies, and it probably ought not to be lost track of. Maybe it ought to be a preamble to whatever we're doing anyway. You ought to be testing it to see whether or not it really does still apply, whether in fact the philosophies and goals and objectives and thoughts and wishes and hopes and prayers or whatever the hell they were on the part of that general plan committee that put all that together are still true. Or if they're not still true. And if they're not still true, we ought to face up to the fact that something else is true. And we should be really careful about how we undo the past. Not that it's, sacrosanct, but you sort of have to know where you've been in order to figure out where you want to go.
A comment on this?
Of course.
It seems to me that the uses and the density of those uses have major impact on trip generation, and therefore roadway capacities, parking, those things. So it seems to me like you cannot also consider land use simultaneously. That would be my opinion. So that you have some parallel effort, but basically you're at least portions of the overall issues that Bill brought up in the circulation element are directed to be in response to your decisions on land use.
So, and with that being said, if you take that approach, and then I agree with that. It's where does it come? Where does the motivation come from to start with the circulation element? If we started with land use, and like you said before, there's going to be very little change citywide. So there'd be 90 whatever percent we go. That's the same. That's the same. That's the same. And then when we have the land uses mostly locked in, or at least identify potential change, then when we go back to the circulation element, then we know the densities of uses for the parking, the roads, the electric, the sewers that need to they're either fine or they need to be upgraded or they need to be looked at and addressed. And those pieces that we know are locked into their land use, and we won't be making really any proposal to change that. So we know kind of here's the pieces and here's the circulation connecting pieces. So if we know what the pieces are first, then we can maybe more reasonably look at how we connect those.
Because in theory, the infrastructure supports the uses.
But again, I would suggest that the uses aren't going to change. In reality.
I mean,
So,
In reality, you're right.
So-
I mean, I agree with you that the land uses themselves are not going to change. I think that
Right.
the complexion of the density of those uses may in fact change somewhat, but I don't think this, no matter what we do, I don't think this piece of real estate that is Sausalito has the capacity to do a whole lot different from what it's doing now.
and so I agree with that, and the only question is whether that's true of the industrial zone in the Marinship, and we spent a year talking about that in the Marinship task force and said, you know, we may have some subtle changes in uses down the road, but primarily what needs to be done there is infrastructure, sewers, drainage, the circulation element within the circulation within that.
And acknowledge the high probability that it's going to become a wetland someday.
In some parts of it, yeah. So, again, if we could spend the next 6 months saying, okay, the formal way to do this is land use first, then this, then
You
this.
gotta start somewhere.
And we could spend the next 6 months talking about the fact that the land uses are not going to change. Or we could say, why don't we just start off with the assumption they're not going to change and figure out and start working on issues that actually matter right now.
Yeah.
That are the topic of we confront every, the ferry service, the parking, the transportation, the sewers, the basic infrastructure that's eroded, That is what matters right now. We're not changing, we're gonna tinker with land uses at best. So that's not the driver to the problems that we need to solve. I would suggest.
Would you?
I'm leaning toward the same. I think, yeah. I mean, I see the logic of your approach, but I think we can knock it out.
And I'm not, I agree, I hear that. I see that is something we can get our hands on now. It's a little more fresh from after the Marinship committee had met, and in fact, we can begin with the Marinship if we wanted to, and circulation within that, and then expand out to the city. Oftentimes when you do a general plan update, you are, just for the sake of, not being, it is to look at sections of the city and do that in parts and see how they all fit.
Adam, you should have something.
Adam?
No, I think that you said it, Bill, that the goals and policies have to be investigated or verified before we start doing an update, because we live in a different era, different times. We had too many cars here before, now we have too many bicycles. We lived in a different shopping climate. We used to go to stores, now we order things internet. So I think some of these multipliers that relate to each home in the community have changed. We used to quote that 11 vehicle trips are generated by every home, and I doubt that with a 1.2 residential population per unit, at the average of 1.2 people per household, we can generate 11 vehicle trips per day. So these are important issues, but the critical times in this community that when everybody's upset about traffic are summer Friday evening concert in the park for half an hour. Everybody is coming south, and commute time when people who are tired of sitting on 101 are coming through town. And these are all through traffic, internal, not generated here. So they're always going to be around.
So just a step back is, in terms of this work program for the task force, I identified 4 elements or discussion topics. Really is, number one we've been talking about is to confirm the review of the circulation element as the first element for review, and then to follow with the land use. Doesn't have to be an end, follow. And appoint a general plan advisory committee. That the general plan advisory committee acts as the community sounding board for the general plan update process, helps identify issues and opportunities, and helps shape the policy of a new general plan. Adam, you mentioned, I think that I would give them the role, and it's in the second page, of creating a vision and guiding principles to create those.
Does this imply that this task force goes out of business when the general plan advisory committee is formed?
It doesn't have to be. I think I think
But
we
should
still.
it be? I mean,
I-
I'm just wondering what the.
Yeah, I think this was always
what our
conceived.
role is.
Yeah, I think this was conceived as a sort of temporary thing to come back to council with advice on how we're going to do this. In reality, I imagined that then the next group would be us supplemented by
Supplemented by. Right.
volunteers and sort of maybe
Right.
a suit. So I assume that we would be the core that would then grow, was by assuming we wanted to.
Yeah.
It's up to us to advise the council on what we should do.
No, that's why I asked the question, I mean, because these are 2 separate things. There is this task force and then there was this, whatever the other group is called, the advisory.
Is that your thought?
Yes, I do. I think that as we move forward we branch out with more of the outreach to the community, it should begin with an advisory committee that actually is the sounding board. Will be the main focus as we reach out and then redirect policies into this advisory committee, and we start distilling what the issues are. We feed that with staff, and then with the consultant, we draft a new general plan, and then we're done.
Danny, you've been here before, you've done this before. Does that general plan advisory committee, does it have the potential of being segmented into those 2 or 3 that might be really interested in land use, and those 2 or 3 that might be really interested in housing, and those 2 or 3 who would then take ownership of those parts of the general plan and be able to kind of oversee everything else that's going on from their specific point of view? I mean,
That's a good point. Yes, my experience has been that the makeup of the general plan advisory committee are often folks who are particularly interested in particular aspects of the city, and those roles kind of fall into their areas of expertise, and they kind of run with it. But they do come back as a whole to talk about. Yeah.
So it would seem to me important to have those people as advocates for their own, advocates for one specific part of this, which, because if it really is a general plan, there's going to be some contentious issues between parts of it. And so therefore that ought to be on the table all the time. It ought not to be, ignored that someone who thinks that the economic element, which may or may not be part of this particular general plan, was the first one, by pressure from certain members of the community, will have its, or those people who has allegiance, or who have allegiance to that and can argue for it.
I think, there's always going to be, it always goes back to land use, I know this. When we start looking at a map of the city, and, people will go, oh yeah, well, what are we going to do about that site? And what are we going to do about that? well, I want that to occur there, and I want that to occur there, and then that's where everybody gets into like there's a project and there isn't one, but that's where it gets contentious.
Sounds like the housing element to me.
But you do, I mean, you have to look at, okay, 10, 15, 20 years from now, is that parcel going to remain vacant? Likely not. So what is permissible under the general plan now, and what is the zoning that allows it? What is the density that would be permitted? What are the likely uses that will go in? And you plan for it. Adam?
And what it doesn't address today that it could have addressed if people would have thought of it. For example, downtown employee parking off-site so that there are more parking spaces available near the stores. And that is part of the transportation element or circulation element, whatever you want to call it, that people who work downtown don't have to be parked downtown.
We've been talking about that for 20 years here. And I remember the so-called, what was it called? The parking plan task force or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Kate Sears and I were on 20 years ago, 15 years ago. That looked at all of these issues, and the parking problem was, if you eventually look at yourselves, you're the problem. That was kind of what the conclusion was.
In organizing these projects, I always think in terms of who's holding the pencil. Who's actually writing the words, and is that going to be the consultant who you're going to pay to do that at some hourly rate? Is it going to be city staff? Is it going to be your volunteers? In other words, what I'm seeing here is a multi-layered thing: a task force, and then a committee, and then a consultant, and then staff. And where along the line is pencil going to paper, and who's doing it, and how can you minimize the layers to get to that point?
Well, that is part of my job, to make sure that I control what the consultant does, when we need them and when we don't. Because it's the best part of the general plan is to get the input of the community. It's really the community's document, and how it's conveyed. I need to be working with the consultant, not necessarily to be the hand that's writing but to make sure it's conveyed correctly, and they need to then do the appropriate technical analysis that is required of the general plan. That we cannot forego. That has to be done. But the consultant's there to guide, to help with the workload of staff, because it's a huge effort. But they're not driving the community's general plan.
And then is there oversight between this task force or the committee? Obviously, the consultants would submit back to one or both of those bodies,
Right.
and we would review it and say, okay, this can go to council,
Absolutely.
or this can't go to council.
Absolutely.
So let's be clear, after March, it's going to be what group?
Right.
Okay.
Right. This committee plus, or some, akin to the Marin ship.
You see, my question comes back to why can't that committee itself actually be putting pencil and paper in many instances, in terms of saving costs and time with consultant, and then it's tweaked and written and made in proper format and restyled by, you and the consultant, but the committee members actually end up doing the bulk of the work.
They could. My experience has been, I'll be very honest, my experience has been that the longer this, you get everyone's attention, they're excited, but if you lose their interest, they don't show up, it's hard to get their attention. They're very enthusiastic, but then after a year or so, they're not available, they're busy. I'm not going to write it. Danny, you write it.
Yeah, I think.
And I'm not trying to make this,
I see that happen.
I think I would disagree with Peter about the use of consultants, because it isn't so much that the consultants are inventing the information. They're the filter for the information. I don't think that whatever this group may be, whether it's a task force or whether it's advisory committee and so on and so forth, I don't think that we're going to be competent, that's the truth, or intent enough to do all the writing. I think that if we've got good consultants, they ought to be discriminators. They ought to be listening, they ought to be condensing, they ought to be dealing with what is coming out of this group. But I don't think that they would be driving the information. I think they would be filtering and regurgitating it, and mainly because I just don't see a group of citizens being able to put together a cogent.
Were you happy with the consultants for the Marinship study?
Sorry? What was that?
The team that was looking at the Marinship, that year-long effort?
Yeah.
Were you members of the team happy with their work?
Yeah, I think we were. In general, I think we were. I think, in fact, they did exactly that. They listened a lot, they looked at a lot, they brought things up, and they were responsive, and we could not, I don't think, we could have written that.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think the one area with that particular one where I think the consultants just went a little further than as a group we did was their proposed circulation element in Mauritius, for instance.
Yeah, right.
With a road across the top, which
Well,
I'm not sure we would agree with. But
We could have stopped that.
Right.
And we didn't.
And we sort of did
Well,
say we
did
disagree
eventually.
with that.
We eventually did, but
Yeah.
but I think that was, that was, you're right. I mean, that's.
See, that was,
that's
as a
one
member
of
of the public, that was kind of my impression, that the consultant got carried away, not that particular thing, but other areas, and kind of had maybe as an observer, an upside down approach, where he talked about, sort of the maquettes and doing little buildings appearances and these things way, kind of opposite sequence in my personal opinion. So this is, I think, the risk. I'm not sitting here advocate that amateurs should write the thing. I just threw that out.
So Peter, it's a very good point. I mean, the city I did a general plan update with was Sierra Madre in Southern California, and they were very, very suspicious of an outsider coming in and saying how the community should be in 10 to 20 years. And believe me, if it wasn't, I mean, I was the person that had to ensure that that wasn't going to happen in order for this general plan update for them, for Sierra Madre to go as we, to be productive.
Right.
Because it was a very almost no growth community. It was that strong. And there wasn't an in between. There was you're either pro growth or you're no growth, and there's no in between.
Yeah.
But when in reality, if you put those two people together, they have the same idea of how the community should be in 10, 20 years. They just didn't want to talk, But it was my job to make sure that the consultant stuck to what we asked them to do in their charge. And, sure, the idea with the general plan update is to brainstorm and come with ideas. What do you vision? Talk to the younger people, talk to the kids, talk to different segments of the community, and what is it they wish for Sausalito?
Mm-hmm.
That's a starting point. Oh, I think Adam's.
There are also some problem areas that one could turn to a consultant and ask, what solution do you see for these problems? And that is, we have very little flat land, and most of our land is sloping. And how do you satisfy all the land use requirements that require flat land? So these consultants could come forward with some ideas that we don't think of.
So this goes into my third item here. My idea was if this task force recommends to the council that we commence an RFP process, I can begin with developing a work plan and seeking their project proposal to us to determine what their scope of work would be and how their involvement would be. I think it'll give us an idea of what we're looking into without committing at this point, but I think it's important to go out there and determine what, with guidance here.
Yeah, you've got to be very careful because that's a fishing expedition in one way. And you're going to get, it's going to be like bids on not very well done sets of drawings and specifications. You're going to be all over the place unless you're really clear about what it is you're asking for. What we're asking for here is kind of almost like asking them to tell us what we should be asking for.
Right.
It sounds like, I mean,
In some ways, it is. I think it sounds to me like we might be at that point also.
well, yeah, and maybe that's good. Maybe there are enough hungry general plan consultants out there that would be willing to kind of do a primer on what we should be doing.
And they have to do, when they approach this, they do their homework, and the first person they call would be me,
Mm-hmm.
and to get a pulse of
Right.
the community. Now, anything that I'm not, I'm gonna make sure to call my friends and call all of you, and get your input. But,
And the odds are fairly good that they're probably going to want to look at that 1995 general plan.
yeah. But they're gonna hit today.
They may know more about it by the time they make their proposal than we do.
They're gonna go, what are the issues, what are the critical issues, do you anticipate much change?
Well, and there are issues on general plan updates that are being driven by the state now anyway.
Right.
That didn't exist in 1995.
In fact, Bill, isn't that really the key point, that based on the opening conversation here, the general impression is that, and I think it's totally truthful, that we very little change in general plan. What you're really doing is a required update by law, incorporating required legal additions since it was recently drafted. But then, other than that, there's not going to be much change at all. I think we anticipate that. So why wouldn't the direction of the consultant be, we're going to do the de minimis change, we're going to do the minimum changes we possibly can to comply with legal requirements for an update, because in reality, we don't expect a lot of other changes. So instead of, let's start with a blank slate and say, what do everybody think we ought to have for Sausalito? I think that's a whole wasted time, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I agree as well.
But I'm not sure it's just de minimis changes just to comply with state law updates.
No.
Because we clearly have issues around our infrastructure.
Well, yes, right.
And which are caused by time and by
But that's
change
the
of the
middle
universe.
ground. See, that's the next step. Instead of saying we're opening it up to a whole new vision.
Yeah, okay, I agree with that. I agree with that.
And this will be a general plan that says the first thing we have to do is underground all the power lines so that they don't block the drones that are coming in delivering the stuff for Amazon.
Oh, yeah.
And that didn't exist in 1995.
So for tonight,
Yes.
what do we hope to accomplish?
Well, I think, getting your input on these items are good, because I want to make sure that I'm also thinking in the right lines of how we approach this. I don't, I was concerned from the first meeting that there was this task of the task force to answer all these questions, and I do think that that's something we want to, make sure that it's not just a task force meeting monthly talking about this. We have a path forward.
Well, can I make a suggestion? You've indicated that this group wants to come back, wants to make a recommendation to council in March is to have it proceed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, seems to me that we therefore need to come up with the recommendation. Start drafting and preparing what is going to be our recommendation. That this trend, for instance, that this group evolves into whatever you want to call it, your advisory group, by the addition of X number of residents, right, maybe. I'm making it up. I'm not suggesting, but to actually get concrete, not ask questions anymore, get concrete. Put a straw man together of this is how we're going to do it. We meet in February, we review that storm and what our recommendations are going to be. That yes, the general principle is we start with the concept, if that's our view of the circulation element, we're recognizing all the other components need to come in, and we need to hire a consultant to kick this process off, and whatever you want to elaborate on tonight, but let's get it down on paper.
I have a suggestion about that, and that is, I think that Danny's item 3 here, which is to commence an RFP for planning consultants, might in fact be the framework for everything that you just said.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, if you know, you were charged with having to spend the next couple of weeks before we have our next meeting with providing us with what you think that RFP ought to be, that might in fact focus.
That'll put the flesh on the bones on it.
Yeah.
Sure. I agree. And then that,
As if you didn't have enough to do.
yeah. And you know, I will begin with that. I think you know, I can look at the things that we want to focus on in the RFP. That would be probably enhanced by their response.
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
because they
but I
do
think
this
it
for a
would,
living, you know.
I think it's a guide for us as well.
Yeah.
If you've got something that, you know, that if at our next meeting we have that, a summary, an outline document or whatever it is of what you think that RFP ought to be, that we can review, then, you know, then I think it'll focus our thoughts and attention as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. Okay.
Yeah.
And, well, number 4 really is, whether this group wants to discuss in general the outreach and input plan. You know, it's an important component of the general plan update. You know, Bill had brought up that at the last, meeting in November that there was the Governor's Office of Planning and Research were doing these workshops, and I attended one because they were just updating the general plan guidelines, and so I went to the one in San Francisco. And they just adopted now the new general plan guidelines, but it was in draft for a while, and there's still a review period.
Yeah.
But what's my point? Oh, my point is in state law is that really you only need to go out at minimum 2 times.
Yeah, I know.
But I think that's also interesting
Not in
because
this town.
Not in Sausalito.
not as us, I know that made me laugh, but I think every time we have a general plan advisory committee, I would think that the city council would ensure that these are public meetings in which they're, you know, the public is welcome to attend. A lot of it's working sessions, but like this meeting now, it's public.
This,
you know?
yeah, but this is, this whole collection of things in item 4 here, I think is an easy one to kick down to the road to the next page, to the advisory
To the
committee.
advisory
essentially,
committee.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
that advisory committee
Yeah.
is a committee that ought to be
The second
grappling
is-
with that
second is-
and take the responsibility for figuring
Right.
out what the best way to disseminate the information is and how to engage the community.
The hub of the community outreach is that advisory. And so if they want to recommend having a big public workshop, their ongoing meetings are all public, recorded, and whatever, just as the Marineship specific plan task force was. Right?
Yeah.
As opposed to us now, before we've actually formed that group or brought in the consultant, trying to pre-plan an outreach program.
Yeah, yeah.
That's part of what the RFP is about,
Right.
is the outreach program.
In your documents there, and that, you need to put the WAM report in there,
I did, okay.
and also the downtown action report.
Okay. No, thank you. I will. Leave it at it. In my mind, anything and everything that has been done.
That's right.
Yeah.
Should be looked at.
Of
and
course,
just-
but since you listed some.
Sure, sure. I think that it's a huge task to look at everything, and I think that with the help of our experts as well, our consultants, they'll be able to look at the, you know, the policy portions of those and help us distill. But yeah, a lot, I think the General Plan Advisory Committee is one that is formed to stay for the length of time, however length of time that is, for the general plan. And how often do they meet? Well, they'll drive that. Whether it's every month, whether it's at certain milestones in the progress of the general plan update. You know, one thing you want to be careful is you don't want to burn it out. I've seen that occur. If you were to ask me right now, I would love to have a general plan update done in 3 years. And I'll tell you that you go to different cities who've done general plan updates, it can be done. I've seen it. I've seen it done in 2 years. I've seen it done in 5, 6, 7 years. That's not uncommon for that to take that long.
You're thinking it might take 3 years?
I think it could take 3 years, and I'd like to because I think the more you drag it out, you can certainly take 4 or 5 years, you know, if you let it. And I just don't think it's healthy.
Why not just set a really tight schedule?
Why? I mean, Peter, what do you think? You're thinking that's ambitious?
No, Peter wants it done in a year.
No, you heard my comments in an ancient history before, and I promised I wouldn't bring it up again. When, you know, in 1980, we, the Planning Commission, did the rewrite, and you did it in 1 year. But with that, I'm leaving.
Clearly got a volunteer for the advisory committee.
I don't want to, before I get appointed to something.
Yeah,
Thank you all for your work.
Thank you. So we don't have to go into the specifics of this unless you'd like, but I began with, I think, what the General Plan Advisory Committee's role. We don't even have to call it the General Plan Advisory Committee. I've heard it called General Plan Steering Committee, you know, whatever it may be. But I think, you know, staff and the consultant would work very closely with this advisory committee on moving it forward with these issues.
Just to follow up on that, I ran across something on the internet, and this is for the city of Santa Ana, and their general plan circulation element only update. And as of right now, they still haven't finished it, and they began in November 7th, 2011.
That's demoralizing.
But we're gonna move faster. Very focused and efficient.
The question is whether events and the environment move faster than the planning.
Well,
that's right.
that's always true. That's always true. That's how, I mean, you're from the country that has been planning things so much and for so long that whatever they planned for is no longer in existence once they execute it.
Called job retention.
Yeah.
You know, if I could just preface it, this can be really fun and iterative and exciting. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. I think that's, Adam, do you want to
I
say?
agree, because I would look at it as a problem-solving process.
Yes.
We have some problems, we should identify them and try to figure out how to solve those problems.
And focus on those.
Yeah. I mean, honestly,
What's the
you know,
first step on identifying? Maybe that's how we get to be on the middle.
And that's gratifying. That way you can go home and feel you accomplished something that was long awaiting a solution.
yeah. You'll find people who are involved and become General Plan Advisory Committee members find it to be so rewarding because they've never thought they'd be engaged in their community as they have, you know.
Okay.
Never more.
So what else we need to accomplish tonight?
Well, I think I've gotten your input, and I think probably what I'd like to focus on for the next meeting in February is to start drafting an RFP that informs the you know, forms a consultant's role as well as staff's role, how we all fit in with their assistance. And we go from there, just so that I get your input on that and enough, and then I'll think of the things that we had just discussed as far as what our recommendation is to the city council and how we approach this.
Part of that probably ought to be not only an organizational chart, but a flow chart as to what we're,
Oh,
what
that's
we
a
think
great
we
idea.
have to be doing, and
Yeah.
who's going to be doing it, are we, if we continue along, are we kind of get a career committee that you know, looks at all this stuff as it comes through and what, or whatever, you know, but, I mean, I'm mixed up with some stuff right now that has reports being done, and there is a separate editorial committee that drives everybody crazy, but they're an important element in this. So,
One thing I'd really like to avoid, and if there's anything that I've learned, is not to get into wordsmithing that's just so painstaking.
Not right away, anyway.
Not right away, and I think we can avoid it.
Wordsmithing is important.
It is important.
Yeah.
Look at the mention specific.
Yeah, but
Words matter.
They do. Oh, I know a lot.
But I think, I like the flow chart idea, so you can say, okay, this is what we've decided, check, on to the next.
Yeah.
I think that's a great,
And this is kind of the organization. and
Uh-huh.
the people
It's very
that-
clear, yeah.
so.
that's good.
and if you, Bill, if you know, if you have ideas of what one looks like, send it over. But I send them and you know.
Okay, or,
Maybe
you know,
you-
and if you've got something up your sleeve, let me know, because I'll
Okay.
come over and sit down with you.
Okay.
Talk about it.
Great.
One of the perspective I'd like to add is in talking to a number of folks about general plan update, you know, I've got two reactions. Those are people who sort of want to learn more, and those who immediately roll their eyes and say, just to produce another document to put on the shelf. And then they pull the 1995 general plan and start reading policies and say, where was the actual effort by the city to execute on these policies?
Right.
Right? And I could, if I didn't have to bring my copy, but I could pull out policy after policy after policy in which it's clearly just sat on the shelf with absolutely no attempt to execute on that policy.
Right.
So what's that? That was background to say, I think a critical component, if you're going to do this properly, of a general plan, is how you're actually going to execute on it and measure your performance.
That's
on
right,
it.
and if I'm not mistaken, that is part of what the state's update of the general plan guidelines is.
Yes.
And that's not only do you have a policy and a program, you have an implementation plan
Right.
That's exactly.
and a measure.
Yeah. And exactly right.
You measure that against, you know, is this in fact feasible and attainable? You know, do you even talk about whether it makes economic sense?
Right.
To the extent that,
And you almost look at it as an environmental impact statement, and that, you know, what, these are the things you plan on doing, but what are the consequences of not doing them? So you need to
And the
have
when.
a downside as well.
and the who.
Right.
So it's the when and the who. By 2020, 2020, you know, we should be doing this, and who's in charge? Who are the cities in charge, or is it the city with someone else, you know, or the council to direct that?
2020 is a good year.
Um,
DMV just gave my driver's license to 2020.
But that's something that did not exist. That is something that did not exist in older general plans.
That's right.
So you know that was an answer to you can't just do this and spend time doing this and just put it on the shelf.
Would the capital improvements program always reflect policies shown in the
Yes.
general plan? That is the tool, the budgetary tool for implementing the general plan.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was lacking in the 1995 general plan in the economic section.
Right.
The economic section was all about businesses, it wasn't about the city. And if there is an economic section, it ought to be about the city as well.
Right.
Where's the money coming from, how,
Totally agree.
yeah.
Totally agree.
Okay, so I'll come back in February and do a draft RFP and start really honing in on the work program. I invite, I made, that's what this task force is for. You might tell me, Danny, no, but then I'll make the adjustments accordingly, but I'm gonna go ahead and do it.
Something needs to be on paper that we can
Yeah.
argue about.
And we're moving towards the goal of making a recommendation as to how to proceed.
How to proceed.
March.
I'd like to go to the council in March.
Good, excellent, okay.
Because I think, we need to then start this, right?
Yeah, we can start. We'll never do anything.
Okay.
Do we want to look at some good February dates right now?
Yes. Which one? I
Look
prefer,
at some dates that might
The
work
next,
for the next meeting.
I would love to go like a month.
Oh dear, my battery power is low. It's very good.
You want to look at the last weekend in February, or you want to look at the second to last week of February?
Second to the last week,
So starting with the 15th.
the 15th,
I
yeah.
think we are closed on the 15th. But the 16th is not a council meeting, so that is an
That would work for me. The 17th is a planning commission meeting.
The 16th generally?
The following week
I'm not
is,
sure it's
yeah, would be better for me. I'm out of town on Monday and Tuesday of that week you're just talking about, which is Valentine's Day and whatever else goes on there.
We try for the 22nd on Monday?
22nd sounds like it should work.
Yeah, should work for me.
You're in town, right?
I'm leaving on the 24th,
Right,
so
right,
I'm here
right.
on the 22nd.
Okay.
Okay. 6 p.m.
Huh?
Yeah.
That's a maybe for me.
The 22nd?
Okay.
Do we want to
Good
pick
pencil
one,
in
one
there.
backup date right now?
Yeah, I'll send it to everybody.
I have no dates that are better.
You have in February?
I have, the only better dates are the 18th and 19th of February. Otherwise,
And that week didn't work for you, right? The 18th and the
Sorry?
Did the 18th and the 19th work for you, Bill?
What we,
On the end February, that week, the Valentine's Day is on a Sunday, 15th is a Monday, and then the 18th and the 19th is a Thursday and a Friday.
they're okay.
Maybe
Who
the
wants to meet on Friday?
Right, right,
18th.
maybe the 18th?
18th?
You're still there.
I'm still here.
I'm good for
The 18th could work as well.
We looked at 18th and we looked at 22nd.
Yeah, and I think the 18th is the better date because that's the one that Jill definitely can make.
So 18th are good?
For now.
Okay, I'm gonna lock it in tomorrow.
Send it around tomorrow.
Okay, I'll send it. Okay, I think, back to the agenda. Any other comments before we conclude? Okay, well, this meeting's adjourned
Yeah.
until February. We'll
Very good.
confirm the date.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh.
Do you want to turn off?
Yep. Oh, let me, yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Beer.